Welcome to Postcard English Stories, where global events become powerful lessons in English. Today's story takes us into one of the most impactful economic conflicts of our time, the US-China trade war. From tariffs and technology to people and politics, this story reveals how one decision can shape the entire world.
Section 1. Introduction to the US-China Trade War. In recent years, the relationship between China and the United States has become increasingly strained, culminating in what is now known as the US-China Trade War. Officially beginning in 2018 during Donald Trump's presidency, this conflict was driven by accusations that China was engaging in unfair trade practices, including intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, and currency manipulation. In response, the Trump administration imposed significant tariffs on Chinese imports, aiming to reduce the trade deficit and revive domestic manufacturing. A trade war, by definition, is a situation where countries impose tariffs or other barriers against each other's goods in retaliation. The intention is to protect domestic industries, but it often leads to economic disruption on both sides. In this case, China's retaliatory tariffs targeted key American exports such as soybeans and aircraft, affecting sectors like agriculture and technology. What began as an economic strategy quickly evolved into a broader political and ideological conflict. The United States framed its actions as defending fair trade and economic transparency, while China asserted its right to develop without foreign interference. Nationalist rhetoric on both sides made diplomatic solutions more difficult. Businesses and consumers across both nations were significantly affected. American companies relying on Chinese manufacturing saw increased costs, while Chinese exporters faced challenges accessing the U.S. market. Global supply chains were disrupted, prompting many companies to diversify production outside of China. The US-China trade war is more than a policy dispute. It reflects shifting global power structures and economic philosophies. It serves as a vivid example of how international trade decisions can influence political relationships, market stability, and even everyday consumer prices. Section 2. Historical background of US-China trade relations. The economic relationship between the United States and China has evolved dramatically since the 1970s. After decades of isolation, China began opening its economy under Deng Xiaoping. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, WTO, fully integrating into the global market and opening up new avenues for trade. From 2001 to 2018, bilateral trade flourished. The U.S. imported large volumes of low-cost goods from China, while China purchased high-value American exports like aircraft and soybeans. This partnership lifted millions out of poverty in China and provided affordable goods for American consumers. However, it also led to growing economic imbalances. The U.S. trade deficit with China, exceeding $400 billion in 2018, became a focal point of criticism. American policymakers increasingly voiced concerns about China's trade policies, accusing it of intellectual property theft, unfair restrictions on foreign firms, and a lack of market transparency. These issues, left unresolved for years, set the stage for rising tensions. Donald Trump capitalized on public frustration, campaigning on promises to confront China's practices. Once in office, he pursued aggressive trade actions, marking a departure from previous diplomatic approaches. China, in contrast, defended its policies, asserting that it was still transitioning into a fully developed market economy. While acknowledging the benefits gained from global trade, Chinese leaders maintained that demands for reform should respect national sovereignty. This historical backdrop demonstrates that the trade war was not spontaneous. Instead, it was the result of decades of unresolved disputes, conflicting economic systems, and growing global competition. Understanding this context provides insight into the challenges of maintaining balanced trade in an increasingly interconnected world. Section 3. U.S. Tariff Policies and Strategic Goals. The Trump administration's decision to impose tariffs on China was a calculated move aimed at reshaping the economic relationship between the two countries. At the heart of the strategy was the goal of reducing the U.S. trade deficit with China, protecting domestic industries, and pressuring China to change its economic behavior. The first wave of tariffs, announced in 2018, targeted $34 billion worth of Chinese goods, including machinery, electronics, and vehicle parts. These were soon followed by additional rounds, eventually covering more than $360 billion in Chinese imports. The administration claimed that these measures would encourage American companies to bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. and reduce reliance on foreign supply chains. One of the administration's main arguments was that China had benefited unfairly from decades of free trade. Critics of China's policies pointed to forced technology transfers, where American firms operating in China were required to share proprietary information with local partners. They also highlighted the role of state-owned enterprises and massive subsidies, which gave Chinese companies a competitive advantage in global markets. In addition to imposing tariffs, the U.S. sought to leverage its economic power through negotiations. The administration issued a list of demands, including greater access for American companies in Chinese markets, stronger protection of intellectual property rights, and reforms to industrial subsidies. These demands were designed to level the playing field and ensure reciprocity in trade practices. While the strategy was aggressive, its effectiveness remains debated. Some economists argued that the tariffs hurt American businesses and consumers by raising prices and increasing uncertainty. Others believed that a tough stance was necessary to address long-standing issues and reassert U.S. leadership in global trade. Domestically, the tariffs received mixed reactions. Some industries, such as steel and aluminum, welcomed the protection, while others, like agriculture and retail, faced retaliatory tariffs and supply chain disruptions. Farmers, in particular, were hit hard, prompting the government to offer billions in subsidies to offset losses. Ultimately, the U.S. tariff strategy was more than just economic policy. It was a signal of a broader shift in how America viewed its role in the global economy. It marked a departure from the free trade consensus that had dominated U.S. policy for decades, ushering in a more confrontational approach centered on economic nationalism. Section 4. China's retaliatory measures and domestic impact. In response to U.S. tariffs, China implemented its own series of retaliatory measures, signaling its willingness to stand firm in the face of external pressure. These countermeasures were carefully targeted to inflict economic pain while minimizing domestic disruption. China's initial response included tariffs on $34 billion worth of American goods, with a focus on key U.S. exports such as soybeans, pork, and automobiles. These goods were strategically chosen to affect regions that were politically important in the U.S., particularly those that had supported President Trump. The goal was to create domestic pressure within the U.S. to force a change in policy. Beyond tariffs, China also employed non-tariff strategies. These included delaying regulatory approvals for U.S. companies, increasing inspections at ports, and encouraging state-owned firms to avoid American suppliers. These subtle actions allowed China to exert economic pressure without escalating tensions too quickly. The trade war forced China to reevaluate its own economic strategies. Faced with reduced access to the U.S. market, China accelerated efforts to diversify its trade partners and reduce dependency on American technology. Initiatives like Made in China 2025 and the Belt and Road Initiative gained renewed focus, aiming to boost domestic innovation and secure alternative markets. Despite these moves, the tariffs had tangible effects on the Chinese economy. Export growth slowed, investor confidence declined, and manufacturing activity showed signs of contraction. However, the government implemented various stimulus measures to stabilize the economy, including tax cuts, infrastructure investment, and credit support for small businesses. Publicly, Chinese leaders emphasized national unity and resilience. State media portrayed the trade conflict as an unjust attack by the U.S., rallying public support behind the government's stance. Propaganda efforts included documentaries, songs, and even animated videos that highlighted China's strength and criticized American tactics. The broader impact of the trade war on China extended beyond economics. It strengthened calls for greater self-reliance and accelerated policies to reduce technological dependence on the West. Domestic industries were encouraged to innovate, and partnerships with other emerging economies were expanded. In summary, China's response to the trade war combined strategic retaliation with long-term policy adjustments. While the immediate economic impact was significant, the experience also reinforced China's determination to assert itself on the global stage and protect its developmental trajectory. Section 5. Global Economic Impact and Market Reactions. The U.S.-China trade war sent ripples throughout the global economy. As the two largest economies in the world clashed, investors, businesses, and governments around the globe watched anxiously. Financial markets experienced heightened volatility, with stock indices reacting strongly to each round of tariff announcements and trade negotiations. These reactions reflected the level of uncertainty that gripped global commerce. One of the most immediate impacts was the disruption of global supply chains. Many companies, especially in sectors like electronics, automotive, and consumer goods, relied on components from both the U.S. and China. Tariffs forced these businesses to reevaluate sourcing strategies, often resulting in delays, increased costs, and logistical complications. Some firms began relocating parts of their production to third countries like Vietnam, India, or Mexico to avoid tariffs and maintain profitability. Emerging economies also faced consequences. Countries that depended on exports to China or the U.S. saw changes in demand patterns. Commodity exporting nations like Brazil and Australia had to adapt to shifting trade flows, while manufacturing hubs in Southeast Asia saw opportunities to absorb redirected investments. In addition, the trade war affected currency markets. As tensions escalated, investors often turned to safe haven assets such as the US dollar, gold, and Japanese yen. Meanwhile, The Chinese yuan faced depreciation pressures, which further complicated the trade balance dynamics. Global institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank warned of the trade war's potential to slow global growth. In fact, by 2019, global GDP growth forecasts were revised downward, citing trade tensions as a major contributing factor. Business confidence also declined, leading many firms to delay investment decisions amid the uncertainty. Furthermore, the trade conflict pushed the topic of economic decoupling into mainstream discourse. Policymakers began to explore the possibility of reducing interdependence between the U.S. and China, particularly in sensitive sectors such as technology and energy. This notion raised questions about the future of globalization and the structure of international trade. In summary, the U.S.-China trade war was not confined to the borders of the two nations involved. It highlighted the interconnectedness of the global economy and demonstrated how bilateral disputes could have widespread implications. The episode served as a wake-up call for governments and businesses to reassess economic strategies in an increasingly unpredictable world. Section 6. Media, Propaganda, and AI-powered messaging. Beyond economics, the U.S.-China trade war was also fought in the realm of information and public perception. Both nations utilized media, digital platforms, and advanced technologies like artificial intelligence, AI, to shape narratives, influence public opinion, and gain international support. China, in particular, leveraged its state-controlled media to frame the trade war as an unjustified attack by the United States on a peaceful, developing nation. Editorials, TV segments, and viral videos were crafted to foster a sense of national unity and to paint the Chinese government as standing up for fairness and sovereignty. AI-generated content was used to produce engaging media pieces quickly, such as animated explainer videos and satirical music clips that resonated with younger audiences. One notable example was the creation of an AI-generated song titled "Look What You Taxed Us Through," which humorously criticized the U.S. tariffs while promoting resilience. Another was a short sci-fi film called Tariff, portraying a dystopian future shaped by misguided trade policies. These efforts were not only creative, but also strategically distributed through social media channels to maximize reach. The U.S., on the other hand, emphasized transparency and protection of intellectual property in its messaging. American officials frequently held press briefings and published policy documents explaining the rationale behind the tariffs. U.S. media outlets, although more diverse in perspectives, generally reflected concerns over Chinese economic practices and national security implications. The information war extended beyond national borders. Both sides engaged international audiences to justify their positions. China sought support from developing nations by portraying the conflict as a larger struggle between emerging economies and Western dominance. Meanwhile, the U.S. appealed to allies in Europe and Asia, urging a unified stance against what it viewed as unfair trade behavior. The use of AI in this context represented a new frontier in digital diplomacy and propaganda. With algorithms capable of generating persuasive content at scale, both governments explored innovative ways to reach their audiences and control narratives. These developments raised ethical questions about the use of AI in political communication and the potential for misinformation. Ultimately, the media front of the U.S.-China trade war demonstrated that modern conflicts are not limited to economic or military dimensions. Control over information and perception is just as critical. The role of AI, digital storytelling, and strategic messaging will likely grow in importance in future geopolitical disputes, influencing how people understand and respond to global events. Section 7. Public opinion and political responses. The trade war between the United States and China triggered a wide range of public and political reactions in both countries. In the United States, opinions were sharply divided along political and economic lines. Supporters of the tariffs, particularly among conservative voters and industrial workers, viewed the measures as long overdue steps to hold China accountable and protect American jobs. They believed the U.S. had allowed China too much freedom in trade, leading to job losses and the erosion of manufacturing. However, critics, including many economists, business leaders, and Democratic lawmakers, argued that the tariffs were economically damaging and diplomatically risky. They pointed to rising consumer prices, supply chain disruptions, and retaliatory actions from China that hurt American exporters. Many feared the trade war would lead to long-term instability in global markets. In China, public opinion was generally supportive of the government's response, reflecting a strong sense of nationalism and unity. State media promoted the idea that China was defending its dignity and right to economic development. Citizens were encouraged to show solidarity by supporting domestic products and reducing reliance on American goods. This sentiment was particularly strong among younger generations, who viewed the conflict as part of a broader struggle for national identity and global status. Politically, the trade war influenced elections and policy-making in both countries. In the U.S., trade policy became a key issue during the 2020 presidential election. President Trump continued to defend his approach, while Democratic challenger Joe Biden promised a more multilateral and strategic stance. Meanwhile, Chinese leaders used the trade war to strengthen domestic reforms and promote self-reliance, especially in critical sectors like technology. At the international level, the trade war forced other nations to take sides or remain neutral. Countries like Canada, Germany, and Japan faced pressure to align with one of the two powers, often balancing economic interests with geopolitical considerations. Global opinion was mixed. Some sympathized with America's concerns about trade imbalances, while others criticized the unilateral approach taken by the Trump administration. Overall, the trade war did more than affect economies. It shaped political discourse, altered alliances, and deepened ideological divisions. It demonstrated how economic policy can become a powerful tool of national strategy, influencing not only markets, but also minds. Section 8. Lessons learned and future outlook. The U.S.-China trade war offers several key lessons for policymakers, businesses, and global citizens. First, it underscored the risks of heavy reliance on any single trade partner. Both the U.S. and China experienced disruptions due to their interdependence, prompting a reevaluation of supply chains, trade agreements, and long-term economic strategies. Second, the conflict highlighted the limits of using tariffs as a tool for systemic change. While they can apply pressure and signal intent, tariffs alone may not be sufficient to compel major policy shifts, especially from large, resilient economies like China. Instead, a mix of diplomacy, alliances, and structural reforms may be more effective in resolving deep-rooted trade issues. For businesses, the trade war was a wake-up call about the importance of diversification and agility. Companies that adapted quickly by shifting production or finding new markets fared better than those caught off guard. The need for risk management, especially in international trade, became more apparent. Consumers also became more aware of the global nature of the products they use and the hidden costs of economic conflict. Rising prices and limited availability of goods made the impact of international policies more tangible to everyday people. This awareness could influence future consumer behavior and advocacy. From a geopolitical standpoint, the trade war marked a turning point in U.S.-China relations. It moved beyond economics into areas of technology, security, and ideology. The tensions sparked debates about decoupling and the future of globalization, raising questions about whether the world is headed toward more fragmentation or renewed cooperation. Looking ahead, both countries seem to have taken lessons from the experience. The U.S., under new leadership, has maintained a firm stance on China, but emphasized coalition building and strategic competition. China has doubled down on innovation, aiming for greater self-sufficiency and global influence. For the world at large, the trade war serves as a reminder of how interconnected and fragile the global economic system is. It stresses the importance of dialogue, trust building, and the need for international institutions that can mediate and resolve disputes fairly. In conclusion, while the U.S.-China trade war exposed vulnerabilities, it also opened pathways for reform and resilience. Whether these lessons lead to more stability or future conflicts will depend on how leaders, businesses, and citizens choose to act in a rapidly changing world.
Thanks for joining us on Postcard English Stories. We hope this story not only helped you improve your English, but also gave you a deeper understanding of global events that shape our world. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Every click helps us bring you more stories, more lessons, and more ways to grow your English skills. Hit the bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next story.